The scariest part of sleeping in a truck isn't the fear of someone breaking your window. It's the realization that there is a hollow, unlit storage compartment directly beneath your mattress, and the access hatch is on the outside. Last winter, I locked myself inside my cab to survive a freezing night in the Wyoming desert. I thought I was in a rolling vault. I didn't realize someone was already inside the pitch-black void, right beneath my spine. It was 2:14 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday in November. I was pushing a heavy load of freight straight through the red desert on I-80 West. If you have ever driven that specific stretch between Wamsutter and Point of Rocks, you know it is one of the most desolate, unforgiving environments in the country. It is a high-altitude wasteland. No cell service, no streetlights, just the howling crosswinds and the rhythmic, vibrating roar of a 500-horsepower diesel engine. I was at hour 13 of my logbook. My eyelids were getting dangerously heavy, and the white lines on the road were starting to blur. I couldn't make it to the truck stop in Rock Springs. I had to pull over immediately, or I was going to put the rig in a ditch. I took the next exit, a nameless, unlit gravel chain-up area, surrounded by endless miles of sagebrush. I pulled the air brakes. The heavy, mechanical hiss echoed across the empty dirt lot. I left the massive diesel engine idling to keep the cab warm and power the heater. I went through the standard trucker security ritual. I locked the heavy doors, and I took the seat belts and looped them tightly through the interior door handles, buckling them in. Even if someone had a master key, they couldn't physically pull the doors open from the outside. I was secured. I climbed into the back, pulled the heavy blackout curtains closed behind the driver's seat, and collapsed onto the lower bunk. The acoustic masking of an idling sleeper cab is absolute. The engine rumble vibrates through the mattress, drowning out the wind and the highway. You can't hear anything outside the truck, but you can feel it. I was drifting off when the mattress slowly shifted beneath my weight. Heavy rigs use active air suspension. When weight shifts on the frame, the airbags automatically inflate or deflate to keep the cab level. While laying perfectly still in the dark, I heard a sharp, mechanical hiss from the air valves under the floorboards, and the entire sleeper cab tilted back just a fraction of an inch. My breathing stopped. We were miles away from another human being. The wind outside was blowing at 40 miles an hour, and the temperature was sitting in the single digits. I didn't open the curtains. I didn't turn on a light. I just listened. Over the low hum of the diesel, I heard a wet, rattling cough. It was so close, it sounded like it was inside the cab with me. Then, I heard a heavy metallic clack. It was the exterior latch of the jockey box. Every sleeper cab has exterior luggage compartments. Metal doors on the outside of the truck where drivers keep heavy tools and extra fluids. What most people don't know is that those exterior compartments open directly into the hollow storage cavity underneath the lower bunk. I was lying on my mattress, and I could hear movement in the dark, hollow space directly beneath my spine. I didn't grab a weapon. I didn't try to look under the bed. I scrambled out of the bunk, tore through the blackout curtains, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I ripped the parking brakes release, threw the transmission into gear, and mashed the throttle. The engine roared, and something heavy slammed against the floorboards from inside the cavity. The heavy rig lurched forward, throwing gravel across the empty lot as I merged violently back onto I-80. I didn't stop. I pushed the truck to 75 miles an hour, praying that the sheer force of the wind and the violent rattling of the trailer would force whoever had climbed into the underbunk storage to bail out. I drove for 3 straight hours, my eyes darting to the mirrors every 5 seconds. I saw nothing but darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the brightly lit, heavily populated distribution center in Salt Lake City as the sun was finally coming up. I pulled into the receiving bay, killed the engine, and grabbed my heavy steel tire thumper. I stepped out of the driver's door and walked around to the back of the cab. The metal catwalk was empty, but the heavy metal door of the exterior jockey box was hanging wide open. I walked closer, my grip tightening on the heavy steel club. I looked inside the dark, hollow compartment that ran directly underneath my bed. It was empty. I stood there in the freezing morning air, staring at the empty metal box. I tried to convince myself it was just some homeless guy, someone who busted the lock to stay warm and jumped out when we hit the mountain passes in Utah. I turned around, climbed back into the driver's seat, and grabbed my logbook. The air inside the sleeper berth was sweltering. It was easily 90 degrees in that small space. I looked down at the floor-level air return vent at the base of my bed. The cheap plastic grate had been popped off. Someone had reached through the open vent hole, grabbed the heavy mechanical override dial on the heating core, and cranked it to its maximum output. Sitting on the interior floorboard, right next to that open hole, was a heavily soiled pair of wool gloves. I stared at the gloves. The physical reality of the night suddenly snapped into place. When I pulled over in Wyoming, I had immediately locked the doors and looped the seatbelts through the interior handles. Nobody could have gotten in from the outside. The exterior jockey box hadn't been pried open from the outside. The latch had been pushed open from the inside. I didn't pull the curtains back to check the sleeper. I didn't try to be a hero with my tire thumper. I backed slowly out of the driver's door, dropped onto the asphalt, and walked straight into the terminal security office to call the Salt Lake police. When the officers finally swept the truck, they didn't find anyone in the jockey box. But they found exactly where he had been staying. They pulled back the heavy blackout curtains on the upper bunk, the bed I never used. Tucked deep against the back wall, hidden under the mattress, was a nest of shredded moving blankets and empty water bottles. And buried in the center of that nest was a crumpled, grease-stained receipt from a diner in Lincoln, Nebraska. A diner I had stopped at 4 days and 800 miles ago. He didn't climb into the slipstream in Wyoming to get out of the wind. He had been living in the upper bunk of my locked truck for half the week. He only climbed down into the floorboards that night because the desert drop in temperature finally made the cab too cold for him to stay up top. He waited until I parked in Salt Lake City, pushed the exterior hatch open, just to make it look like he bailed out on the highway, and simply walked out the back of the terminal while I was packing my bags in the front seat. For 4 days, I locked the doors, looped the seatbelts, and slept in the lower bunk, completely unaware of the man breathing quietly in the dark, just 2 feet above my head. If you pick up a hitchhiker on a dark highway, and he starts coughing every time you hear a noise from your sleeper berth, do not ignore it. He isn't sick. He's just running cover. He is actively making noise to drown out the sound of his partner breaching your blind spot. Last April, I picked up a shivering guy on US 93. I didn't realize that while I was fighting to unlock my passenger door, his partner was using that exact distraction to climb my frame rails. And I didn't realize the heavy thud against my back wall wasn't just a guy riding on the outside of my truck. US 93 is a desolate, unforgiving stretch of 2-lane blacktop between Wickenburg and Wiki-Up. Some drivers call parts of it Blood Alley. There is zero ambient light out there, no cell service, and no shoulder to safely pull onto. It's just the hypnotic, endless rhythm of the dashed white lines and the black ocean of the high desert on either side. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Springtime in the Mojave means massive, violent thermal shifts. The asphalt bakes at 85 degrees during the afternoon, and the air plummets into the freezing low 40s by midnight. I saw a man walking the gravel shoulder in a thin, frayed denim jacket. He was shivering violently under the amber glow of my high beams, his head tucked down against the bitter crosswind. Against every survival instinct I had developed in 20 years of driving, I pulled the yellow air brake valve. The heavy rig hissed to a halt, kicking up a massive, blinding cloud of white alkali dust into the headlights. The passenger door on my old Peterbilt was notoriously sticky. You couldn't just reach over and pop the lock. I had to physically unbuckle my seatbelt, lean my entire upper body across the wide center console, and repeatedly shove my shoulder against the heavy interior door panel, while the guy outside fumbled with the frozen exterior handle. It took him a solid 20 seconds of yanking and pulling before the latch finally gave way with a heavy metallic clack. 20 seconds where my eyes and my entire situational awareness were locked completely on the right side of the cab. For 20 seconds, I had my back completely turned to the driver's side mirrors. He climbed in. The cab instantly smelled like wet sagebrush, dried sweat, and stale tobacco. He didn't have a bag. He didn't have a phone. He didn't even look at me. He just nodded a silent acknowledgement, buckled his heavy nylon seatbelt, and stared straight ahead through the bug-splattered windshield. I threw the transmission back into gear and got the 80,000-pound rig back up to highway speeds. 10 miles up the dark road, over the steady, vibrating roar of the diesel engine, I heard a sharp, rubbery squeal from the sleeper berth directly behind me. It was followed almost immediately by a dull, heavy thud. My eyes darted to the driver's side mirror, but the angle was perfectly blind. The 24-inch gap between the back of the sleeper cab and the flat aluminum nose of the 53-foot trailer is a visual dead zone. If someone is lying flat on the metal grating of the catwalk back there, you cannot see them. I kept my eyes locked on the white lines, letting the vibration of the road numb my hands. The hitchhiker hadn't shifted his weight once. He was sitting rigidly, staring at the upper corner of the windshield, using the dark tint of the glass to watch my eyes in the reflection. Every time the chassis flexed on a curve, or every time I heard a faint, metallic scrape from the sleeper wall, he'd let out a dry, violent, hacking cough. It wasn't a sick man's cough. It felt like rehearsed. For the next 40 miles, the cab felt like a pressure cooker. I realized the smell of wet sagebrush had slowly faded, replaced by something distinctly cold. It was the smell of raw night air and diesel exhaust. My mind raced through every possibility, but the reality was simpler and much more dangerous. It took me a while to understand. When the orange sodium lights of the Kingman interchange finally bled into the cab, I felt the passenger seat shift. He unbuckled his heavy nylon harness before I even touched the service brakes. The second the rig downshifted for the first red light, he grabbed the handle, shoved the door wide, and dropped into the intersection. He didn't walk away. He jogged toward the shadows of an abandoned way station. A split second later, the truck's air ride suspension hissed, dipping sharply on the driver's side. I looked in my left mirror just in time to catch a flash of movement. A second, darker figure dropping down from my fuel tank, hitting the wet asphalt and sprinting across the intersection to join him. I didn't stay to ask questions. I slammed the passenger door and pushed the rig another quarter-mile to a brightly lit pilot station. I parked under a floodlight and grabbed my heavy mag light. I walked straight to the driver's side fuel tank. The exterior baggage door, the rectangular aluminum panel sitting 18 inches below where my pillow rests, was hanging wide open, vibrating against the frame. I hooked my fingers under the edge and flashed my light inside. My spare chains and emergency coolant jugs hadn't been thrown out. They were shoved violently against the back wall. The ribbed aluminum floor was covered in wet, white alkali dust. Right in the center were the smeared impressions of heavy work boots, shifting around in a tight space. I backed away, the bile rising in my throat. As I retreated, the flashlight hit the black rubber weather stripping on the bottom lip of the door frame. Sitting perfectly in a row were 4 small black Phillips head screws. They weren't rusted. They were clean. I knew exactly where they came from. They belonged to the thin plastic bulkhead divider, the flimsy interior access panel that separates the outside storage box from the hollow cavity directly underneath my sleeper mattress. I flashed the beam up toward the ceiling of the compartment. The plastic divider wasn't just unscrewed, it was pushed completely out of the way. The hitchhiker was never sick. His 20-second distraction was exactly enough time for his partner to step onto the fuel tank, slide into the exterior box, and pull the door shut behind him. For 40 miles, while I gripped the wheel and listened to that hacking cough, a second man had been lying inches beneath my spine, quietly taking apart the floor of my cab. I don't know why they bailed at the Kingman interchange. Maybe they just needed a ghost ride past the federal checkpoints. Maybe I was supposed to be the cargo, and the red light just threw off their timing. I didn't wait around to find out. I still drive US 93, and I still run the night shifts. But every time I see a shivering shadow standing on the shoulder in the freezing wind, I don't reach for the air brakes. I just grip the wheel and stare straight ahead, living with the memory of exactly what a 20-second mistake buys you on Blood Alley. When you drive the long, flat stretch of US 287 through the Texas Panhandle at 3 in the morning, your brain learns to filter out anything that doesn't affect the truck. The road is straight, the shoulders are wide. You watch the reflectors and the center line. Just past a stretch of broken fencing, my high beams caught a man walking south along the right shoulder. He leaned hard to the left, his right leg dragged behind him, the boot tracing a slow arc through the gravel. It looked like an injury, maybe a bad knee or a hip gone wrong. I figured he'd come from a stalled pickup or a ranch road I hadn't noticed in the dark. People end up on foot out here, more often than they should. I checked the mirrors as I passed, but the dust from my tires swallowed him. I kept my speed. There was a truck stop ahead. I planned to report it when I got there. It didn't feel urgent. It felt like something I could hand off. But later, I realized the distance I'd covered didn't match where I saw him next. 15 minutes down the road, I saw him again. Same shoulder, same direction, same uneven movement. Left side carrying the weight, right leg dragging through the gravel. The posture matched exactly. I checked the clock and did the math without thinking. At my speed, I'd put at least 15 miles behind me. A man moving like that wouldn't clear a mile in that time. I told myself it wasn't the same person. Could have been 2 people from the same breakdown. Or maybe I'd misjudged the time. The road doesn't give you good reference points out there. The dark flattens everything. As I closed in, he stopped. He crouched slowly, bracing one hand on the ground, and began gathering loose gravel into a small pile on the white line. The motion was steady, careful, no urgency. I hit the air horn. The blast carried across the fields. He didn't react, didn't turn, just kept placing stones, one by one. I passed him again, watching in the mirror, until the shoulder disappeared behind the trailer. The pile of gravel stayed visible for a moment longer than it should have. That section of 287 doesn't have crossings or service roads for miles. It's open land, fences, drainage cuts, nothing that would let someone move ahead without being seen. I hadn't passed anyone. No headlights, no taillights. The road had been empty since Amarillo. When I saw him the third time, he was already ahead of me. Same gait, same slow drag of the right leg. I backed off the throttle and watched him longer this time. I tried to track his position against the fence posts and reflectors. There was no point where he could have entered the road, no point where he could have crossed. He was just there. I told myself someone must have picked him up and dropped him further along. Maybe a driver I missed in the mirrors. But that didn't line up either. There hadn't been any passing traffic. As I got closer, he shifted his weight again and resumed walking. The movement was slow, consistent, like it had been the first time. No sign of strain changing, no adjustment, just the same step and drag, step and drag. I eased down to around 40 and let the truck roll up on him. When I passed, I kept my eyes on the passenger window instead of the road, for a second longer than I should have. His head was angled forward. I couldn't see his face under the hood. The right boot scraped the gravel in that same half-circle motion. I cleared him and checked the mirror immediately. The shoulder behind me was empty. No shape, no movement. Just the dust settling back into the ditch. A second later, I heard it. Scrape, step, scrape, step. The same cadence. It wasn't coming from behind the trailer. It was coming from the passenger side door, right outside the glass. The timing matched what I'd just seen. I didn't look. I kept both hands on the wheel and stared forward. The sound stayed level with the cab, not drifting back, not fading. It held position with me as the truck moved. I pressed the accelerator. The engine picked up. Wind noise increased. The rhythm didn't change. Same interval, same weight in the step. I held the wheel steady and kept my eyes forward. The scraping continued beside the door. No shift in the suspension, no pull in the steering. Nothing to suggest extra weight on the truck. Just the sound. Close enough that it should have been visible in the side mirror if I turned my head. I didn't. I focused on the lane markings. The lines passed under the headlights in a steady pattern. The sound stayed fixed. Then something struck the passenger side mirror housing. A heavy impact, sharp. The mirror snapped inward against the window with enough force to rattle the frame. For a split second, I saw dark fabric pressed against the glass. A sleeve, an elbow, bent tight against it at an angle that didn't match the position of the door. Then it was gone. The scraping stopped. The wind and engine noise filled the space where it had been. The mirror hung loose, vibrating against the door, until I slowed enough for it to settle. I didn't stop until I reached a lit travel center outside Wichita Falls. I parked under the brightest light I could find and sat in the cab until my hands stopped shaking. The sky was starting to lighten. I stepped out and walked around to the passenger side. The lower steps were clean, no scuffs, no disturbed dust. I pushed the mirror back into position. Along the top edge of the housing, there was a thick smear of red clay. It had dried in place. 5 shallow grooves ran through it, parallel, as if something had pressed into it while it was still soft. The height didn't match anything on the ground. There was no clay on the steps, none on the tires, nothing on the pavement beneath. I wiped it off with a rag from the cab. Later, when I checked the side of the trailer, I found a narrow streak of the same clay along the upper rail, level with the bottom of the window, not the ground. I still run that route. I still watch the shoulders. I haven't seen him again, but I keep checking the mirror before I listen. So, before we clock out for the night, I want to see who else is out here in the dark. Write down where you're from and the exact time you finished listening to this story. Let's see how far the graveyard shift reaches across the globe tonight. If you've ever found a mark or a piece of equipment on your vehicle that you know for an absolute fact wasn't yours, I want to hear about it in the comments down below. Drop a like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications to join the graveyard shift. We have a lot more stories to cover, and as always, thanks for listening.